Welcome to the Church of Mabus radio show. It's Friday night, 7:06 p.m. Central. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM, New Orleans. And we have Wham here with us tonight. How's it going, Wham? Christina's here with us tonight. She's here. She's just taking care of the animals. And Leanna, Renee, Hieber. Did I say that correctly?
It's Hieber. It's a German name, so you pronounce the second
Hieber.
vowel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So great to have you here. And America's Most Gothic, Haunted History, Stranger Than Fiction. And a great book. I really enjoyed it. And is this like a sequel to the Invisible Women book, or are they separate books? It's the same authors, right?
Yeah, it's a great that's a great question. And it is a separate standalone book, but it is sort of our follow-up to A Haunted History of Invisible Women, which Andrea James, my co-author, and myself, we wrote that book with a focus just on women's ghost stories and asking the question, how do we talk about women alive and dead? And it was the first book of its kind to really address ghost lore from just the women's perspective. And so we explored a lot of different stories that we found particularly fascinating, that really grabbed us and captivated us. And then the book did well. We were thrilled by that, and we thank everyone for the support of that book. And then that helped us when Kensington, our publisher, was basically, we all said, well, okay, well, what's next? And rather than doing an additional volume of just more women, because we had lots more we wanted to include, they thought, you've got this whole section here in this follow-up proposal, all of which is about how Gothic literature informs a lot of our ideas about ghost lore. What if we just focused on examining haunted history, but through the lens of Gothic literature, almost as a way in which these tropes and these expectations, these archetypes keep kind of reaffirming themselves in both real history and also in classical literature. So it was a real fun way to unpack real things, real strange things that have happened in this country, but do it from a way where we will compare and contrast with, say, an Edgar Allan Poe story. The sort of the godfather of the American Gothic. And it was a very fun examination. And we did get a chance to address a lot of the women that we didn't have time to do in the first book, and put them into this follow-up. So I was very, very excited that I didn't get to leave anybody out that I had been aching to write about. There's still much more. There's so many more folks that we would still love to write about, but we're not doing this like an encyclopedia. We're doing this sort of volume by volume, making sure that we're trying to take enough time for each particular person. We really try to invest in who were these people while they lived, in addition to what we say about them in their ghost lore.
And I know this is kind of a loaded question, but how would you define Gothic? I've heard so many different definitions of it. I'm just kind of, what are you shooting for with Gothic?
Well, for me, I usually have a shorthand. And when I say a book is a Gothic novel, it usually has to have, for me, about 3 core characteristics that just about every Gothic will have. And the first and foremost is setting is character. And so we lay this out in the introduction, where the Gothic does tend to defy a rigid definition. However, it does tend to have certain qualities that reoccur throughout every Gothic novel. Setting being character, the idea that you are immersed in a very atmospheric setting. Very often, the setting will be maybe involved in the title of the book, such as the case with the very first Gothic novel, which was called The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764 by Horace Walpole in England. He himself had built himself a sort of a neo-Gothic castle in which to live. He very much was kind of living the part of this Gothic hero as he was writing in the 18th century. And so setting being character, sometimes it is, again, a titular, the idea of Dracula, Castle Dracula, very much is a part of that whole experience. You feel like you are in this castle as Jonathan Harker is questioning his senses. That leads us to our second of what I think is our 3 metrics, is psychological focus. You have to have a narrative where it's focusing on the psychology of the main characters and what they're going through, and their senses are going to be tested. They're going to question their senses. They're going to wonder about what's happening. Can they believe their own eyes? Can they believe their own sense of whether sanity or any of the five, let alone a sixth sense? And then the idea that in addition to psychological focus, you have to have an engine that is driving the narrative, that is propelled not necessarily by action and action and action, or a violence, or some sort of really rapidly escalatory thing. More often than not, the engine of the Gothic driving the narrative is actually dread. So it's a suspenseful narrative rather than, say, an action film. One of the things I think that we were talking earlier before we went live about Guillermo del Toro, one of the reasons why Crimson Peak, one of my very favorite films, didn't land with the audience as much as because they thought it was just going to be sort of a horror film, when it's actually a Gothic romance. It's actually a much quieter narrative where you're not really expecting all the jump scares of all of the ghosts. The ghosts, in fact, in that narrative are helping the heroine try to escape her situation. But it's not structured like a traditional horror film. It's in fact structured like a Gothic. So folks who were going in expecting a Gothic narrative, they got exactly what they hoped for. That was me. But people who are hoping for the jump scares in a traditional horror narrative, they were surprised that it was in fact so psychological, that it was in fact so character driven, and not as much into that idea of the horror, constant, nonstop driving narrative that we see in a lot of more modern films. So, but the Gothic's having a nice resurgence. So we're seeing that play out in a whole different, we have a real Gothic renaissance happening right now. So we're really thrilled to be part of that.
Definitely so many great things, and we're talking about Edgar's and all the stuff he's doing, and I guess as an example, let's talk about the Bear Woman at first. So we can that would be one of the main stories that start off everything. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that one's written by my co-author. So we split the book up into sections. And so there are things that Andrea focused on. She herself is Canadian, and she immigrated to the United States. She's fully a citizen here, but she has a lot of ties to her Canadian heritage. And this story of Marguerite de la Roche is a really incredible, real woman who lived, who was in fact abandoned, and all of this folklore that really was struck up around her. And Andrea does a beautiful job of unpacking all of that. It is very also atmospheric. And she also just talks about the strength of a woman who is trying to raise a baby alone in the midst of being stranded and against very harsh conditions. So she became known as the Bear Woman because she did, in fact, defend her child, her baby, against a bear, supposedly in folklore. And she became this sort of larger than life figure. So she's a great example of one of the types of elements that we talk about is, when does the narrative kind of get away from reality, or when is it reinforced, in fact, by real things that happened? And so there's a lot of myth making as well as some real true aspects of this woman's pretty inspiring and harrowing journey that Andrew did a really good job of bringing to life. And we started with that one. Our editor, Liz May, she did a great job when she was structuring the book at trying to lead us through what is sort of a Gothic trajectory. All of the book has 7 different sections in it, and each one of the sections is sort of a progression through a Gothic storyline. So we start with the wild and foreboding landscape, that idea of setting as character. So we start with that, and the Andrea's Bear Woman chapter does a great job of putting us into that very, very harrowing circumstance. And I wouldn't have wanted to be put in that situation, but I certainly enjoyed reading about it.
Did you do the ships chapter?
I did. Dead Ships and Dark Dreams. That's where my great love of ghost ships came in. I'd been traveling up for the past 10 years up to this one particular part of southern Maine. Wolf's Neck Preserve is this beautiful nature preserve in just beyond Portland, Maine. And it is just this beautiful, beautiful landscape. But the acoustics are really funny there, where you'll get like some really interesting echoes off of the bay. And I could just imagine if it was this dark and stormy night where you feel like you have this sound that's in front of you. I heard people talking when I was there at the edge of this bay, looking out, at the edge of the ocean, and then the scraggly rocks and this really dynamic atmosphere all around me. And I couldn't see anyone in front of me except that I heard their voices right in front of me. But it was the way the acoustics was bouncing off of the rocks around the bay there that made it seem like the sounds were right in front of me, but they were in fact behind me, almost, a quarter of a mile away. So this kind of jarring and unnerving acoustics made me think, wow, that's a really great element of what could have been a legitimately thought to be a ghost story, because you hear voices and you don't see anyone in front of you. So I thought that really lent itself to the idea of all of these wonderfully rich, centuries old histories of ghost ships sighted along this particular bay. And there were ships that ran aground on these very dangerous rocks. They're right out into the bay there. They're all very sharp. They're all very dynamic. They look beautiful against the water, but it's very dangerous and treacherous with this very, very jagged coastline to be sailing in and out of these ports. And Casco Bay had some very famous, downed ships through the years, ships that just never came back to port. And so ghost ships have a very long and storied sighting around this particular part. And the idea of fog descending, all of the atmospheric qualities that you would expect on a rugged coastal American Gothic really kind of came to bear as I was researching this. And I had wonderful help with the Brick Store Museum, which is a lovely little, a small little historical museum in Kennebunk, southern Maine. And they were so wonderful about their own particular archives of a doomed ship called the Isidore, where every single, to a man, every single sailor had a bad dream about the ship the night before they launched, and it in fact never made it back to port. And everyone on the ship perished, and all of the family members talked about how they all had these premonitions of something happening to the ship, and that in fact proving true. So kind of these mysterious omens, these dark dreams, all of these things kind of factoring into this ghost lore of Americana that does in fact parallel real ships going aground in dangerous conditions. So it's a beautiful landscape, but it can definitely prove treacherous. And it was another one of those things where it made me think, wow, I love going on board a tall ship. I love being around historic rigging and things like that. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to man one.
What years was this? Like the time periods? When there was pirates or different? It was
Yeah. So originally the Dash. I talk about the Dash, which is one of the most famous of these Casco Bay and the Freeport region. The dead ship of Harpswell and Freeport, sort of the shared bay there. This was a privateering vessel. So we're talking late 1700s and into what would be the early days of the War of 1812 in some of these cases. So privateering vessels, yes, piracy depended on if you had a privateering license and whose crown you were loyal to, depending on if you were or were not a legitimate pirate. So there was a lot of kind of wild history along the coasts, and also some literal land pirates who were honestly just clever thieves who would create fake lighthouses by creating, and we see this in the Daphne du Maurier novel, Jamaica Inn, which was a Alfred Hitchcock film, where there's people who create a fake lighthouse, and in this case that's set in Cornwall in England, to run a ship aground to rocks, and then thieves would steal all the contents of the ships. And this happened also in our country along the Massachusetts coast and along the Maine coast. And Massachusetts and Maine were at a time they had been kind of the same territories. So there's all of this kind of difficult and fraught and dangerous history, and who is benefiting from what along the coastline. That created a lot of very, very dark and kind of sinister history, but also Maine as a state separating away from Massachusetts later in our American history really didn't have much support during the War of 1812. And so the Dash was trying to actually navigate around some of the blockades. And she did very successful privateering missions. And then on her like 16th voyage or something, she did not come back. And it was said that the ghost ship docked. And the ghost ship was seen to have docked at many different times going forward in history. And that as some of the family members began to pass away, some of the sightings of the ship were seen around the time of other family members of those original shipmates was coming to collect their departed family members. So there's this interesting sort of family legacy that follows this idea of these ghost ships, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Definitely. A fake lighthouses. Wow. How do you do that? That's got to be a pain.
I mean, they would set up fires on the tops of rocks, and it would look like an old fashioned lighthouse. And it fooled people. It fooled people on the English coast. It fooled people here in this country too. So, and then just, piracy abounded. It was hard. There was not a lot of, policing of coastal waters up until our much more modern era.
Christina was going to ask or wanted me to ask, do you have any personal experiences with any ghost encounters or paranormal anything?
Oh, absolutely. And both of the books, both A Haunted History of Invisible Women and as well as America's Most Gothic, I was given free reign and free leave to talk about the different paranormal experiences I've had. More of them fit into the themes of America's Most Gothic, though, than did in the first book. So I talked about my money getting stolen and returned to me when I worked in a haunted speakeasy in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I've had things taken from me and returned to me. I've seen things. I've heard things. I've been grabbed on the shoulder. I've been grabbed by the hand before by spectral things. Usually when I'm not paying attention, so I just think it's someone else. I turn around, there's nothing there. I've heard things. I've heard a lot of different what would be known as a clairaudient haunting through the years, and not all of them are the same. Very often, I'll have sort of a I don't know if it's as a haunting as much as almost like a coincidence that's too uncanny to be a coincidence, where I'll see something and find something relevant at one moment and maybe even take action on it, and then the next day I'll read about it in the haunted narrative I'm in fact working on for a book. Interesting things where I'll pick up on something I think as I'm writing, oh, I wonder if this could be in play, and then I do a little bit more digging of research. Oh, in fact, that absolutely was. My instinct was completely correct about something that I kind of intuited about things. So I've had spikes of pain when I've gone by buildings that I didn't know until later were in fact very haunted narratives. When I've gone and to visit particularly known haunted spaces, I've had very, very physical, visceral reactions. I talk about that when I went to Gettysburg, about the migraine I had the minute that I turned on to what I later learned was part of the battlefield itself. I didn't know at that point. I just thought it was farmland, and then later found out that no, there was actually a battle that had taken place right there. I turned onto a county road and had to pull over because I had this migraine that just was so sudden and so violent that I almost got nauseous. And so I actually had to stop the car. I definitely feel there's an energy sensitivity that's there. And I can go into a little bit more detail about a specific story. It just kind of depends. There's a range of them. I do discuss them as they're relevant. One of the things that I didn't want to do within the book is to talk so much about my own experiences that I didn't let these stories speak for themselves. I want to make sure, yes, I have my own understanding of the narratives. And because the Gothic asks for a psychological focus, I am bringing my own opinion and thoughts to bear in these narratives, as is Andrea. But I want to make sure that I'm not taking away from the fact that, all right, these were real people. There were real casualties here. There were real people involved. Here's my experience with this place, and here's why I care about it, and why I hope that I can make my readers care about it too. Because that's one of the great things about haunted history, is it makes a historic space relevant to us now, because the haunting is happening in our current moment. It's bringing the past present. What can that tell us about our time frame, about what our anxieties are in our current moment? The idea of the Gothic being a resurgence right now, the Gothic as a genre puts its finger on the pulse of the anxieties of the age in which it is written. And we live in a very anxious time. We live in a very divisive time. We live in a very violent time. And it's a very difficult time globally. And I think we're really seeing a lot of those anxieties playing out in some of our fiction, in some of the films that we're watching, in some of the things that we're reading or seeing on television, or even in the dialogue that we're having with people, because Gothic as a genre can help us explore those anxieties safely while still being able to have a conversation about it rather than just an argument about it.
Definitely, and definitely crazy times. I was all shook up about the Rob Reiner thing. Man, that's
Oh
just
my
that
goodness. Oh my
sucks.
goodness. What a visionary director. And like, just adding so much to our common vernacular, our little casual phrases. I say, taking it up to 11 all the time. I just think about things that are just part of our daily sort of references, these little casual catchphrases, and how many of them are his work. And it's heartbreaking. Being in the industry, is very few people who weren't affected by his films, who weren't moved by something. And as varied as his work was, from Stand By Me to thinking about the hilarity of Spinal Tap or When Harry Met Sally, just like the range of things. It's a heartbreaking loss. And sometimes I just think, how can we bear it? But then I think
Yeah.
that's why storytelling is here to help us get through all of it, because we can process our emotions through the stories we tell.
Shawshank Redemption,
Yes,
Misery. He just did
absolutely.
a new Spinal Tap. I haven't seen it yet, but it's on HBO, a sequel to
I
it.
know, I know. I haven't gotten to it yet either, and now it's just gonna be something where you just cry your way through it, even
Yeah,
while you're laughing.
that sucks. But well, what is one of the main reasons we do the show is I've had UFO and paranormal encounters since my early 20s, and a lot of it we've done shows on trauma. I'm a testicular cancer survivor, and then my dad died, so we think it
Mm,
opens up our senses when you go through stuff like that with trauma
yeah.
and things like that. I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the experiences that you've had that maybe shook you up to the core, or what were some of the most the craziest ones?
Well, I definitely, this was not necessarily a traumatic experience, although it does have to deal with loss, but it was an expected loss, but it also, I think, in some ways saved my life. When my great-grandmother passed, I'm named for her, and we knew that she was transitioning out of this world. She had lived a long and full life. My father went up to be with her. I had fallen ill. I was about 6 years old, and I had a very high fever, like 105 degrees, which for a 6-year-old could be deadly. My mom's a nurse. We lived out in the middle of nowhere, about half an hour to any kind of hospital. So she's getting ready to take me to the ER. And right as we're about ready to leave, my fever breaks and I start talking about God and the angels using words that I had never been taught, like liturgical words, big words. I always had a big vocabulary, but this was another level. And my fever was gone. I talked about this literally heavenly experience. And then we got the phone call immediately thereafter that my great grandmother had just passed. I kind of think that she kind of, on her tour around visiting loved ones, I think maybe I was part of that, and her namesake. And I kind of think she broke my fever while doing so. It was all such a, the timing of it was too coincidental to be coincidence. And I've always kind of felt like she's a bit of a guardian angel ever since. And so I think that there's, for me, ghost lore is really interesting in that that's somebody's loved one. Even in the scary stuff, that's maybe somebody's loved one. So what is there for us? The door for me was certainly opened. I think at that point, the door to the beyond was opened. I had this kind of like out of body experience, truly, that was very, very intense. And I don't really have a memory of that as much as I sort of was in a trance channeling of that kind of situation. So, and it was, again, my mom, very rational nurse, was like, I've never seen anything quite like this. But, folks who are in the medical profession have seen all kinds of interesting things in near death experiences or in visitation kind of experiences. Energy, something happens. And so for me, that mystery, that question mark, that big question mark, is what drives me to continue seeking and searching, and a certain amount of love and honoring the fact that that was something that kind of opened a certain door for my mind and my heart, and I've tried not to shut that door too much. If it's a negative energy, I shut it. I curate my energetic spaces, and I curate the spaces and people that I speak to about these kinds of things, well, because I want to make sure that I'm not engaging in a toxic feedback loop with stuff. So I try to take great care with all of these things. However, um, I am interested in, okay, well, what is, as best as we can, tell the truth of these things? I know I have a very active imagination. I'm a storyteller by nature. And so I always try to go into a space skeptic first and a believer if all of the various scientific aspects are ruled out, that with the science that we know so far. I don't think that science and the paranormal are at odds. I think that the paranormal is just a spectrum of science that we just don't fully understand yet, because when you start thinking about theoretical physics, a lot of it starts sounding like a ghost story. So I think there's a lot of ways for this to be parallel and entwined, and we may get to a point in our scientific discoveries where we can bridge some of those gaps. In the meantime, there's this kind of incredible divine mystery, and that's really what drives me, is a sense of interest in these kinds of stories, and how they can bring people together, and yes, can in fact help heal trauma. Some of the ups and downs of my life, I can definitely track that there was a little bit more paranormal behavior happening around me at times when I was struggling with some stuff, just trying to figure out my pathway in life, trying to figure out navigate different spaces and people around me. Maybe I wasn't around the best people for me at certain points in my life. And so there's kind of a way in which you can kind of track sometimes the kind of the sine wave of paranormal activity to what kinds of things are around you in your living environment, and how is that affecting this external paranormal environment that may or may not be affecting you. I do think everybody has the capacity to be psychically sensitive on one way or another. I think it's a sense that everyone has the ability to. I think we train it out of people. And I certainly definitely tamped down on it as a kid, because there was only certain spaces where that was helpful or even healthy to engage in at certain points, because I had other things going on in the living world. I couldn't necessarily always have my foot into the spectral. So, but it's an ongoing dialogue I love to have with people, because every single time I learn something, or someone shares something meaningful about their experiences. So ghost lore for me is an opportunity for further exchange and building community.
I forgot I muted dogs. But one of my big encounters has been seeing beings of light, and I've seen them completely sober with my naked eyes, and seen two leave my house down here in Florida at Silver Lake as if they were in it and flew into the heavens, and I was nothing. I mean, I was completely sober. I've seen stuff messed up partying, but that time nothing.
Right.
Completely sober. And it was like two people made of light, as if they'd been in the house and just came out the roof and flew into the heavens. And I'll never forget it. I think it may be my dad, or I don't really know. I've heard so many different things of what it could be, from aliens to angels to yada, 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 to Project Blue Beam hallucinations. But there's so many different things. But the ghost thing's fascinating. We've been watching a lot of those paranormal videos, like Slapped Ham and that stuff on YouTube. And I think some of it's real, but you certainly just don't know. But it is interesting to think about some of the stuff that's going on in some of those videos. It's like, it seems like there's always some kind of trickster element, and they always kind of seem like they can't. I mean, maybe they can do something to hurt you, like scratch you, and that sucks. But it seems like a lot of them can just move a door or turn a light off. That's about the extent of it. But one of the most interesting things, and maybe you have some feedback on this, is ghost clothes. I always wonder about their clothes and what they're wearing. Is that what you get stuck with forever when you die in it? Do you get a ghost wardrobe? What do what do you get a hold of when you're dead? And I know there's rumors that you're stuck with what you died in. And I'd like to think that's not true.
I agree with you. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think it almost becomes a certain point of identity. And it's funny that you ask this question, and that we're talking about this, because I used to work for a television studio in Manhattan that would do press junkets, and would do, like, famous people would come in and talk about what show they were doing. When Neil deGrasse Tyson came in to talk about the Cosmos show that he was doing, he and I were chatting between the interviews, because I was a stage manager there. And I said, well, I work with ghost stories and I tell ghost stories for a living. I write them. I'm a ghost tour guide in New York City. So I have a lot of thoughts about all that. And he goes, okay, ghost clothes. Same thing you just said. Ghost clothes. Where do they come from? Why are they wearing what they're wearing? Do they have a wardrobe? All of this, and it was such a funny thing, and I never actually had really thought about that until that moment. And he goes, so if you talk to any of them, you got to ask them, like, for science. So, not to say that he believed, but it was a very funny kind of way we were talking about it. But it does go to this question of what is the human eye? What are we processing when we see a ghost, and what are we looking at? And now in my fiction, I am very clear about the ghost having the ability to choose how they present themselves, because I personally want that sense of agency and autonomy. I want the freedom to decide how I appear to someone. I do think that if there is a ghost there that is very clear that they are in the outfit that they died in, if someone is seeing a distressed, bloodied outfit, that could be a sign that that's the ghost wants to remind people that that is in fact how they died. It could very much could be a sense of they died in violence, and so it's the psychic imprint of the violent act in and of itself, rather than it necessarily being a what would be known more as more of a conscientious or relational spirit rather than a psychic imprint. The idea of a cognizant spirit and an active haunting versus the psychic imprint. I think more often than not, you see the violence or the moment of death represented more almost in a psychic imprint, like that idea of flash paper upon a given space. So I do think that there is a little bit of leeway here, because no one's paranormal experience is exactly the same. All of us have different ways we see. We all have different abilities. I have to wear glasses. This eye doesn't work as well as this eye. I don't see ghosts in the same way that, say, my partner Tom sees ghosts. He can see things in a different spectrum. Now he also has epilepsy, and so in that regard, there's an idea of, oh, can different neurological spaces allow us to see different spectrums of light, because a lot of his epilepsy is in fact light and aura triggered. So there's all these different ways. Some of us have better sense of smell, some of us have better hearing than others. So I do also think that how we interpret what we're seeing spectrally can range very much so. And maybe how some entity appears to one person, they may appear very differently to someone else. It might depend on what their relationship to them is in life. When we're talking about, a lot of these historic hauntings, we try to say, okay, well, when they've been seen repeatedly, it's usually been like this, but here's a couple of outliers. We try to present as many things as we could find in archives and say, all right, here's what we got. Here's what made it to the New York Times. Here's what made it to the museum's, folkloric accounts, and our personal experiences in this house museum. And then we let the reader decide what they think about it too, because the reader is a part of this too. None of us are here to say we can prove one thing exactly or another, because we can't. And we're not here to tell anybody what to believe, because I do believe that one's own experience with the paranormal is deeply personal.
Did you have to do with the Florida chapter, or was that your other part?
That's Andrea. She did that one. Yeah.
Do you remember much from it? That anything you could share? Mostly because Florida, right? That's what it's referring to. Yeah, Florida.
Absolutely. And one of the things that she wanted to do with that chapter very specifically is to discuss the fact that there were enslaved people on plantations in Florida's history. And so she just talked very specifically about that history and how she found it kind of inadvertently when she was going down with her family to Disney World. So, the idea that there is a lot of very difficult history in our country, and we can't look away from it. We can't act like it didn't happen. We have to just sit with that discomfort. And so that's what she's asking us to do in that chapter. And I think she did it really beautifully.
Yeah, where I'm at in Florida, there's a place called Dozier in Mariana, which was you might have heard of it. It had a craziness that happened there, but we had something down the road from us from Graceville that is very upsetting. It was a place called Heritage Trail, and it was this guy that owned the Bible college across from us, and he brought all these like old buildings there, like a church, and I guess I don't know if it was plantation times or what, but it was. I call it Little House on the Prairie, and he
Hmm.
set it up. But the weirdest thing about it is there's a plaque there that tells you a story, and basically the gist of it is that the Spanish came through here and they tried to convert the natives, and one of the natives had more than one wife and he didn't want to have just one wife. So the next thing you know, there's a bloodbath down there in that place. And this little place down the road. Well, guess what they just did, this Bible college? They just burned the whole place down and they're going to put a sports stadium over it. And
Wow.
it's so
Wow.
God. Like
Yeah,
that's
I
how you
mean,
get a skinwalker.
there's
But
a
yeah.
lot. Well,
But the
there's a lot too of, and there's unfortunately a lot of moments in folkloric narratives that are kind of displacing a lot of things onto native populations as a way of almost offshoring things, when that's not necessarily coming from, native traditions. So it's that gets additionally difficult then when also the history is then getting, like you said, erased from this, additionally on top of it. So it's like the layers to getting to the truth very often are very, very, very complicated. And I all I all I can say to just sort of like address that is the idea that we have to keep asking questions, and we have to keep asking, all right, who is benefiting from a certain narrative versus who is being harmed by a certain narrative. And we try our best not to continue to recreate harmful narratives if at all possible.
Well, I hope they have Native American ghost stuff happen to them at least on some kind of level during their sportsing.
I
This is
mean, yeah,
the same.
it's there when there's disrespect happening. I think that's the stuff that upsets me the most about things like the ghost shows that go in kind of yelling at ghosts and things if they go into the spirit world, or they go in and kind of making demands of the spirit world if they go into a supposed haunted location, especially if it's a location of trauma and pain, and suffering, to go in and like kind of try to get a rise out of the spirit world. That's the stuff for me that I get really upset about, because Andrea and I both our golden rule about this work is respect for the dead. It doesn't mean we're not, addressing some, there are villains in history, and we treat them as such. We don't try to rehabilitate someone who was violent. We are very clear about all of that, but at the same time, the general respect for a location where suffering happened, as that being real people, not a Hollywood invention.
Wham's friend Bruce Hallenbeck has a book about the Kinderfell creature with small town monsters, and there was some paranormal.
Kinderhook.
Kinderhook. Okay,
Kinderhook.
Kinderhook. Always mess it up. But anyway, they saw a blob there, like some kind of entity that was like a blob. And some people saw the Virgin Mary, and other people saw the blob, and it's like a real crazy case. It's weird how the trickster element kind of plays to what you believe in, and that's what I think ghosts can do that too on some level. Like they can adjust to it.
I definitely think that we all have our own kind of what our mind will go to something familiar, or go to something that we feel is safe, or will struggle in the face of something that we can't understand. And I think it is very, very interesting. It's very telling from one person to the next what people might experience in a given place. And so when people ask me about things like, are you worried going into to haunted spaces or things like that? I have my own little personal rituals. I have my own little personal things that I do for myself. A little bit of psychic shielding, stuff like that. But I think that I try not to let my mind run too far away from me, because I do know that I could get myself really, really psyched out and really, really terrified in a given space if I let myself.
And let's see what was the next chapter. What's one of the main chapters that maybe you want to make sure we talk about that you did in the book?
Um, I I particularly enjoyed talking about my alma mater, which is Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And I spent a really lovely 4 years there, and I was a graduate there with a BFA in theater performance with a minor in the 19th century, in the Victorian era specifically, because I've always had an interest in history. And there's a figure there that even people who never went to Miami, if I mention talking about ghost lore, people will go, "Oh, Helen Peabody! I've heard that story of the women's college president who's still haunting her hall." So the Peabody Hall on the western campus part of Miami University had been a women's college, and then in the 1970s it became co-ed, and Helen Peabody's ghost lore became very, very prominent the moment that that school became co-ed, because people who knew that Peabody Hall was named for Helen Peabody, who had lived in the 19th century. She'd spent almost 30 years running this particular women's college with a bit of an iron fist. She was definitely a controlling presence, not because she wanted to control people for her own sake, but she really believed in very thorough education for women. And she believed in teaching them equally to men. She believed in teaching them all the disciplines that any of the men's colleges would be teaching. And that was rare at the time. And she really, she was demanding of her students because she wanted them to believe in themselves at a time when women had so few rights. And so she was kind of a stickler for control. And so this then ended up in a lot of her ghostly narratives. And the ghostly narrative, the idea that she was haunting that hall, pretty much became kind of synonymous with the time it was renamed for her. It had been Seminary Hall before her death. And then in 1905, it turned over to from Seminary Hall to Peabody Hall, and in honor of her. And from that point on, people kind of just associated her with that space. And then during the co-ed time, then it became, oh, she's going to be rolling in her grave about there being men in her women's college. And the ghost lore started. It was so common. It was like the first day I'm there. We're taking orientation, and then people are telling ghost stories like by the evening of my first day on campus. And so I was hearing about Helen Peabody kind of looming over and lording over the men of Peabody Hall, and from the moment that I started attending college. And one of my favorite narratives about this is the idea that, like, I heard several different iterations of this particular story through the years. So I think that this became something that just, there was more than one case of this, where a couple of young men who had heard that Helen Peabody did not like misbehavior in her hall taunted her to get her to react. There's a beautiful big portrait of her right in the center of the front foyer of Peabody Hall. You walk in the front door. This is long hallway. It's this historic 19th century building. And then you see this very no nonsense picture of Helen Peabody. She's just kind of staring out at the viewer in her 19th century dress, just sort of like with, studying the viewer with a little bit of a "don't try me" face on. And she's not very old in this picture. She's in her 30s. And I love that this lady who literally kind of, with that expression, kind of says, "Try me." And these kids did. So they said very disrespectful things in front of her portrait. And then that evening, as they were studying for finals, they heard raps and knocks from within their wardrobe. They watched their desk lamp fly off of their desk. This happened a lot. The desk lamps move a lot in Peabody Hall. I heard at least 20 different times where there was poltergeist activities where lamps in particular were moving off of desks. This happens for them. They're kind of getting freaked out. They notice that the message light is blinking. So this was back in the days of, like, the dial-up phones, right? This was back in the days when everyone had a landline. So this was like a 1990s story. So I attended college there. I graduated in 2001. So I was there in the late 90s. And so I had a landline in my dorm room as well. And they noticed that their light was blinking, but there hadn't been calls there just was all of these message lights. And then they unplugged the phone, but then the message light was still blinking. And they got very freaked out about this. And they went to their resident assistant, the RA, who was, managing their floor. And the RA had warned them, like, don't mess with the portrait. Like, I don't want to have to deal with 3 a.m. people freaking out because you mess with the portrait. It had become so common that the RAs just said, just whatever you do, just don't mess with the portrait because she will wake you up in the middle of the night. And so the RA is noticing, like, okay, well, maybe I can call the telecommunications office and see if there's some kind of call that's been made to your room for there to be the message light on. And they managed to get access to the message that was in fact there. Their room had received 200 calls over the course of the night. And when they actually accessed a message, it was a recording of all of the rude things that these men had said in front of her portrait. So she literally had the receipts for their misbehavior, and she played that back for them. and as if this was not as if this wasn't enough, when the two gentlemen who perpetrated the disrespect, one of them like slept down the hall in their friend's room. The bigger guy of the two of them was like, a sports guy. He's like, fine, I'm gonna sleep. He's usually kind of a light sleeper, but he was in this dead sleep, this absolutely unable to be awakened sleep. And when he finally was roused the next morning, he was like white as a sheet because he said that there was this angry little woman who was pinning him down and chastising him for his disrespect. So, I mean, she wants respect. That's all. Just don't be. You can be in her house. This is her house, but you got to respect her house.
Definitely. And I keep thinking of the Wednesday show and stuff with all the weird teachers and all that stuff.
It's exactly, and it's so funny too. Yeah, definitely seeing things like Wednesday. It's like, oh yeah, that's almost like a Helen Peabody moment with the ghost teachers. So, but I really think it's very interesting. One of the things I wanted to do with her narrative is that so much is focused on her as this controlling, domineering figure. And I wanted to really kind of go back to talk about who this woman was during her life as an actual women's rights leader. She was in the 1850s. She's running an institution. Very often, people running women's colleges in the 19th century were very often male administrators running women's colleges. So she was the star student of Mary Lyon, who had created Mount Holyoke College, and so she was the kind of the next in line of sort of the Mount Holyoke of the West. At that point is what they had called Miami. At that point it was called Western Seminary for Women. And she was a leadership figure, and she was controlling because she really, really wanted women during the 4 years that she had them to have control over their own lives at a point when women had no control outside of that institution, because there were no rights about their bodies. There were no rights about their ability to own property. There was no rights about the ability to own a bank account or to set one up, or any of the various things that we take for granted now as being able to have our own autonomous rights. That was something that Helen Peabody wanted to grant her charges just within the 4 years when she could have them in Peabody Hall and hope to make the best of them.
A dog just party fouled a drink on my legs. I'll live. But luckily it wasn't that full, but my legs smell like some kind of booze that Christina had. But I was just laughing. It's all on my feet. But good job, Harley. Thanks for the party foul.
Okay, well, at least it was a ghost and not, or at least it was a dog and not a ghost. Yeah. Sometimes my drink will just knock over, and I'm not quite sure if it's just me being klutzy or if it's a visitation.
We had once at another house that we were at, a glass exploded, and it was really a strange thing where it was not hot and then cold or anything. It was really strange. In the same house, we had something hit the bed after her grandmother passed, and some things like that. And something hit the RV once when we were in it, like it slapped it, and it in the yard, and no one's around out there. I don't know what it was, but we've had some weird stuff like that for sure.
Yeah,
some ghostly things. And there's been times when I've done, it's been a while since I've done psychedelics, but I saw Native American spirits like they were dressed up on mushrooms once, and then I ran out of the house. I was in my 20s, but I saw them. I was like, oh, it scared me, and I ran out.
Yeah,
But
I can't say I've ever done psychedelics because I've figured no, my mind is on its own journey enough. I don't need to exacerbate it.
yeah, I can't now for sure. I'll be in the emergency room, I'm sure. But what about Ghost Brides? Was that your chapter or
That's Andrea's. Yep, that's Andrea's. And we do mark all of them. You'll know as you look at the book. Where every chapter opens up with whether Andrea or I wrote it. That was just, she really enjoyed the idea of Ghost Brides as a concept because they crop up a lot. So one of the things is we want to address sometimes in our work is this idea like what become these amalgams? And in a lot of cases, these ghost brides are completely invented. They were not real people, and yet they still persist in ghost lore. So she completely unpacks that as a way to talk about the idea of the bride being this kind of liminal point between the idea of a childhood and an adulthood, and that also being something that is sometimes fraught for people through history. So that's the institution of marriage is sometimes a cautionary tale for some women historically, and it's a lot. There's a lot to parse. There's a lot of really interesting different stories. She's tongue in cheek with a lot of it too, because again, a lot of these things are completely invented, but they're coming from an anxiety that people do have about the idea of, okay, well, does marriage mean I don't have freedom anymore? And that's not just for a woman's concern. That's just kind of for everybody's concern. Does this mean at what point, at what critical juncture of my life is it now changing? So that's just something that she addresses and brings a lot of different kinds of stories from around the country into that particular. We do some chapters that are considered omnibus chapters where we're talking about a bunch of different things over the course of a one chapter. Like I do that with the Great American Castle, where I talk about the propensity that wealthy eccentrics in the 19th century and the early 20th century, if you're a wealthy and eccentric, what did you do? You built a castle. And so we've got some great examples of that all around the country. So I talk about some of those and the various hauntings therein. And that was a particularly fun chapter for me to do, where I got to talk about some really fun, colorful figures in ghost lore. One of them being one of my favorite locations was Hammond Castle out in Gloucester, Massachusetts. That's a really, really fun place.
Christina's asked about Marie Laveau. Is there something about her, Crossroads, or?
Not at the crossroads. So Marie Laveau, we talk about her sort of very briefly in our first book, An Haunted History of Invisible Women. We talk about her very briefly, but because neither Andrea nor I are practitioners in that tradition, we want to be extremely respectful of that tradition because there's been a lot of misunderstanding about her through the years. So we mention her as a figure and then allow her to be a part of that narrative in so much as further reading, we recommend further reading. In terms of the crossroads for me, I talk about, that is my chapter where I talk about motorcycle ghosts that there's several different motorcycle ghosts in Ohio specifically, one of which I experienced myself. And then I talk about Resurrection Mary, who is a very famous Chicago ghost. And she's fascinating because she went dancing one night and then never returned home because she got into a car accident. That's the lore about her. So her lore is that she is still hitching a ride home from the ballroom. And she has been danced with and felt and picked up by people through the years. Not as many current, not as many modern sightings of Resurrection Mary, but her lore is so pervasive through Chicago that anyone who had been raised anywhere near it had always heard her tale. To the point where, even police officers had thought they'd saw a young woman walking by the side of the road and then, stopped in to ask about, is this young woman okay? And then no one could find her or place her. So that the idea of a spirit at the crossroads, I use both the motorcycle ghosts and Resurrection Mary as a way to discuss the idea of how ghost lore through the years has changed depending whether it's a highwayman or a carriage accident or some other conveyance through modern transportation that has crashed at a particularly perilous cross in a road. And so there is a ghostly figure that's there to kind of warn you to slow down around the sharp winding curves or to be mindful of this particular intersection. And so the idea of the ghosts themselves being at the crossroads, we'll find a lot of by the wayside or hitchhiker spirits and ghosts through a lot of ghost lore. So I do talk about some, there's a really great academic book about the ghostly hitchhiker as a recurring trope in American ghost lore. My own motorcycle ghost story, I thought it was just, one of those urban legends that, this type of urban legend is very common around the country where, you hear as a kid, you go to this one bend in the road, or in our case, it was a really, really sharp, very, very steep hill, and you pull over to the side of the road and you flash your headlights 3 times and then something's supposed to appear. Again, this is a common urban legend. So I just thought that this was, all right, well, this is just something that people say to go do. And so we're just going to do it because we lived in the middle of nowhere in rural Ohio. There's nothing else to do. Might as well try to see if we can find the motorcycle ghost. And his lore was that you talk to one person and they say, oh, it was in the 1950s. You talk to another person saying, no, it was in the 1970s. It was somebody who, was either a veteran and come back from the war and his sweetheart was with someone else and he sped off on his motorcycle and crashed. Or it was a disagreement or an argument, or, he sped away. Regardless, he sped away with a broken heart. That seemed to be the through line of the narrative, and crashed on this very, very dangerous, very steep hill. Okay, so again, I'm thinking, sure, because no one could place a name to this, no one could place a specific year. It didn't crop up in particular. Motorcycle accidents were very common in the very, very treacherous paths of rural Ohio. So it wasn't pinned to any one particular police report. But here we go, 4 friends and we pull over to the side of the road, and my friend Erin in her red Jeep flashes the headlights 3 times. And sure enough, at the top of this very steep hill, there is a kind of foggy central light, like a headlight of a motorcycle. And this solitary light floats down the large hill, and there's no sound attached to it. It's just the light. And we're all freaking out, and we all ask each other, and we were stone cold sober. We were very obedient kids. We liked trespassing in graveyards, but that was the extent of it. We weren't drinking. We didn't have any drugs. We just were like, let's go see the ghost. So we were completely sober, asking each other, what are we seeing? All of us saw this light. None of us heard anything associated with it. As it was about to go down to the dip in the road, it instead did not go down the dip, but in fact floated over the dip in the road just a few yards ahead of us, and then dissipated. But if it had continued its trajectory, as it passed us, even though it had dissipated by this point, if it had been maintaining its speed, at that point, it crashed. This very loud, very, very distinct metal crash sounded on the top of the vehicle. And it was it sounded like a car accident. And we screamed. I've never screamed that much in my life. I don't think my friends screamed that much in our life. And we tore out. Aaron just tore out from the side of the road. And there's no like side of the road. This was like, we were almost in a ditch kind of level. So again, these are not finished roadways hardly at this point. And it's 20 miles before we have any civilization again, before we get to a gas station parking lot and finally pause the car, get out of the car, and look on the top of the car, because surely a sound like that had to leave a mark. Nothing. Pristine. Like nothing had hit it, like nothing had... We had no idea what made that sound. We all heard it. We all screamed. And then we just didn't go back because we thought, all right, well, that's very definitive. That whatever that entity was telling us, like, be safe, like, don't do this. What are you doing? I talked to a girl. So during book tour for America's Most Gothic, I went back to Miami University. So this motorcycle ghost is not far from my college. So I'm talking about the motorcycle ghost in a college class because the Miami Alumni Association has brought me into school to say, hey, here's a best-selling author. She's one of your, she's an alumni of this very college. So she's going to come and talk to your class. And so I was telling them ghost stories because that's what people like to hear. And I was talking about the motorcycle ghost. And this young woman comes up to me. She goes, oh, yeah, we went many times and it got really, really mad. The last time that we went, the light turned red and then it cracked our window. And I was like, well, what did you go and do that multiple times for? The ghost said what it said. It was telling you to get out. Why did you test it? So I'm one of those folks where if I feel like there has been a warning shot fired, I do not test the warning shot. So that's my PSA. If there is a ghost that makes it clear in no uncertain terms that you should get out, and then you shouldn't test it. Just saying.
Definitely. We just had Maxim Furyk on. He was I forget the guy's name, unfortunately, but the guy that passed away from the Annabelle doll, the paranormal investigator, he had just taken a picture with that guy with the doll. When we were telling that story, that was definitely creepy. But because he was just there with the guy, and then the guy went on and passed away. So he was there with the guy, and they actually took a picture with him with the guy that passed away, supposedly from all that situation. But yeah, definitely, I understand about the ghost shot thing. It's interesting how a lot of these stories about the vehicles show up in different states. Like I know some, here and in Georgia where I'm from, and it's weird how they have like a protector role in that on some level. And then a lot of the paranormal videos, of course, get into that subject. And there was one guy in a foreign country that the guy was, and I don't know if it was real. I mean, you don't know. That's the point of it all. But someone was telling him, one of his managers was telling him that there was someone in the car with him. And the guy goes, no, they're not. There isn't. And it turns out that I guess it was picking up somebody sitting in the car with him when it wasn't there. And there's a lot of weird stuff like that that's really creepy, that any of it could be fake, so you don't ever know. But I think some of it's real. But how do you know unless you're there?
Well, I mean, that was the thing I didn't expect. We all thought we were just kind of bored, and it was one of those things where none of us thought something was really gonna show up. I was shocked to hear, that almost 30 years later, that there's still students trying this too, and that there's still something that's showing up for people, to the point where there was multiple experiences for this one girl, and that it changed to actually create almost a violence with like a cracked window. And I was like, oh no, if that light turned red, I am sorry, that if that light turned red, that's terrifying, actually. So that was one thing I didn't even expect, that I would hear further stories about one of my own ghost stories, just been in talking to people in the area. And that's one of the things I do love about lore, is that people share their experiences with me as I go and talk with different people in different areas. Because you are right that like this trope is common. It does show up time and again. And I agree with you that I think that it is a protector. I really do believe that the sites that had a crash or something like that, I really do think that there's, if nothing else, like again, a place memory that is trying to avoid there being a literal pileup of other cases. I'd like to think that I'm a big believer in like the helpful ghost. I think that that's a really interesting narrative, and I talk about that in several different chapters in the book. When there's something that becomes a warning, a spirit, I think those things are really incredible. And that's actually what my sort of mental takeaway was from this motorcycle ghost. I was like, how do I even parse that? What's my takeaway from this? And my takeaway was watch your speed, and watch these hills, and don't be reckless on the road. And every time that I am driving really steep roads or really sharp curves, I think about the motorcycle ghost to this day. And if I am being unsafe, I will apologize to the motorcycle ghost, because it taught me better than to be reckless on the road. Because what was that crash on our roof if not a warning?
I've seen a body get carried off from a motorcycle crash that was in a white sheet before, just going by in traffic. It always haunts you when you see stuff like that. It's just so
It's
creepy.
yeah, it's n and this is very real for people. This is very, very real, and these things are, these things I didn't wanna make light of this moment. I thought, "My god, somebody did die at some point on this road, and the least I can do is make sure that I'm trying to drive more safely for myself and any of my loved ones in the car, and anyone else on the road, any stranger that I might pass." That's another thing too, I think that, ghost lore can remind us that at any moment, in the blink of an eye, our lives could change and be shattered. So, try to be kind to yourself and others at any point. You never know. And don't take it for granted.
It's like the stories of the little ghost hands that help move the car and they put powder on them and stuff. There's a lot of those.
Seriously, there's all kinds of situations where stuff has happened. And even some of my most skeptical friends, I think that's one of the reasons why ghost lore really has this pervasive power, is because even the most skeptical of people will have that one story that either happened to them or it happened to a loved one who's similarly skeptical. And they're like, I don't believe in ghosts, but then there was this one thing where I can't explain why I knew how to step to the side at this one moment when something was going to end that they didn't know was going to come flying at them. What are these moments, that these split second moments where something is there intervening, or they're listening to some instinct that they didn't know that they had, listening to a voice or feeling being actually physically moved. uh these things for me are just like kind of enjoyable question marks um that again keep me returning to this lore, because it's always a little bit different. Even if some things are the same, there will be little cultural nuances, there'll be little personal details that will be different. People will reimagine these things for their own circumstances. And sure, if it's all mass hysteria, okay, great, but if it saves lives, then who's it hurting?
Go with the mute again. Uh, what about the vampires of Rhode Island? Was that yours
So
or
that
her?
that's Andrea too. So Andrea did some of the expected famous ones, the real famous things that you would expect. So the idea of the Rhode Island and the New England vampire panic. This was a real thing that happened in our nation's history, where there's literally was a vampire panic prior to the writing of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So prior to our modern understanding of modern vampire lore, there was a group of people in parts of Rhode Island that believed that Mercy Brown, a young woman who died of tuberculosis, was in fact a vampire, because people at that time didn't exactly understand what was happening to corpses as they decayed. And not every corpse would decay in the same way, and certainly not in different environmental conditions. So her corpse just happened to be particularly preserved, and this really freaked people out. And so there was a practice in some of these vampire cases where they would like burn bodies and like snort their bones, literally, like these. And this was considered maybe to be a preventative of becoming a vampire yourself. Some really wild things that kind of fall into sort of the mass hysteria that you could sort of fault something like Salem, Massachusetts, and the witch trials there in the 1690s. We write about that in A Haunted History of Invisible Women, about how that kind of got out of hand. It was little girls kind of getting away, who kind of let a story get away with itself. And then suddenly you have a bunch of witch trials and a bunch of people who are being put to death, mainly so that the city can seize assets. And so in the case of the New England vampire panic, none of that is in play. There's not an agenda happening in that regard. It's superstition involved, certainly. But it's definitely behavior that we would now think, wow, that's really, you're going to snort somebody's bones to prevent becoming a vampire? Well, that's interesting. But at a time when medicine was not uniform, at a time when superstition and magic and science and all of that was additionally a big old question mark, you kind of can't blame people for trying to do what they thought was sort of like a folkloric remedy for various things. So it's kind of a fascinating situation of another woman whose story kind of got away from her, because poor Mercy Brown, her grave has to be kind of constantly watched and constantly guarded over, because it'll get desecrated, or it'll get covered over by things, and even people well-meaning will end up tromping over this actual person's real grave. And so again, we're trying to kind of like sift through some of the aggrandizing and try to get to the truth of who really were these people and what were the historic accounts that then got misconstrued through the years. Because there's a lot of games of telephone that get played when you talk about a 1700s, 1800s, 1900s kind of story. A lot of things change through the years, but yet they're still captivating the imagination, because there's still this kind of this unsettled, unsolved nature of it. Well, what really was going on with that body? Why was it like that? And those are the things that I think we're unsettled as human beings about, what happens after death. And so that's definitely what's in play, is our own anxieties of what happens after we pass. That's what makes ghost lore additionally relevant, additionally stirring, additionally resonant, and part of the dialogue that we are having when we talk about ghost lore is us examining and grappling with and coming to terms with our own discomfort about our own mortality.
William, Christina was asking about your ghost ship story. There's something about a ghost ship that you saw. If you want to share it, I don't know, something about a ghost ship.
We did talk about the ghost ship chapter before, about I myself did not see a ghost ship myself, but I was in the area in southern Maine where I was talking about the acoustics there, and I definitely heard voices that were not in front of me. So I could see how ghost lore would happen, especially in that part of southern Maine. So yeah, we in talking about that, the ghost ship chapter, I loved the idea of a foggy night in that landscape. I could see why someone would, see something piercing through the fog and be not quite sure what they saw. I've written ghost ships in my upcoming fiction. I was so enraptured by the idea of ghost ships as just as a recurring thing that has happened in southern Maine. The ghost ships, there's like 2 centuries worth of lore about it. So I put a ghost ship into one of my fiction stories about a vengeful lady captain and her ghost ship that comes to take vengeance on people who have been wronged and lure them to their deaths in the water. But that's complete fiction, but it's coming from my inspiration from these ghost ships, the narratives that I researched for the nonfiction. And then I have a upcoming, in 2027, there's a book called Ravenfield Hall that I've written, in which I'll be talking about those land pirates and the idea of people deliberately crashing ships to steal the loot, and that leaving a ghostly vengeance on the rocks there that comes to play. Again, that's a completely fictional narrative. However, I am pulling from actual history to do it. So definitely ghost ships became very inspirational to me in my fiction after having written the chapter.
Cool. Wham, where did you see a ghost ship in Hudson Valley?
I have not seen a ghost ship.
I thought you saw something that was ghost ship.
No. People have seen ghost ships in the Hudson Valley, though. He's referring to a book that I wrote about paranormal experience, the kind of the tradition of paranormal experience in the Hudson Valley. And, I don't really focus on ghost ships. I focus more on people's individual experiences and how they sort of fit into some of these traditions, and the source of some of the traditions of paranormal experience, not just ghosts. Ghosts are part of it, but UFOs, cryptids. He mentioned Bruce Hallenbeck, which is one of the people whose experiences I profile in the book. Actually, they're not just his experiences of his family. There's actually a multi-generational set of experiences there. What I was going to ask you was a lot of when I was doing the historical background to provide a context for, this area. There was a distinction that was made by academics. I mean, I come from an academic background, and academics between what's called sentimental literature, or what was called that in the 19th century, and Gothic literature. I mean, I think there's an overlap there between the two. But I guess one of the questions I was going to ask you, and this is more of a kind of a theoretical question more than anything else, what is the relationship that you might see between sentimental literature and Gothic literature? Because when I look at those two things, because both can deal with ghost stories or unusual events, or include folklore or things like that. And of course, the example that a lot of people look at when they're looking at sort of the historical context of the Hudson Valley as because a set that is defined in some ways by a set of literary tropes, when you think about these things, is of course Washington Irving.
Yes.
I mean, he's not the only person, but he's kind of who put these, some of these stories on the map. And when I did a bunch of work on Washington Irving for the book, I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting about what Irving did was that he did he created stories, but he also duplicated stories, and he used the stories that he wrote about as sort of like a foil to include both folklore, but also troubling items. Some of those contested stories, some of those difficult. Like, for example, and a lot of this stuff isn't included in sort of popular mainstream renditions of the stories. Like, for example, Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle. I always get him confused with other people. I don't know why. They're all short. Anyway, he, in the original manuscript, the original version of Rip Van Winkle, he tells a story, and then there's like this weird postscript that is almost never included in popular renditions of the story. And what this postscript does is it completely reframes the story. Because the story of Rip Van Winkle is that he's this guy who's henpecked by his wife, and he gets pissed off, and he and his dog go off on a walk in the Catskills and disappear for 20 years. Because he hears the little people playing ball or whatever they're playing, and then he comes back. But that's not the whole story. In the reframe, in the postscript, he tells the story of a powerful entity that rules over Hunter Mountain, which is the main large peak in the Catskills, and this large this being is a female being. She's like a goddess, if you will. A Manitou, and she oversees everything. And when people get too close, what he does is he duplicates a Lenape story that he was told. And the implication is that if people try to misuse or misunderstand the spirits that really rule this place, strange and terrible things are going to happen to them. And it stands in contrast to this kind of funny Dutch story that actually duplicates a lot of Dutch tropes that are not necessarily, indigenous at all. And people who've done research into this story have found that in Irving's diaries, when he kept diaries of his time going up and down the Hudson River, and in his diary, in which he duplicates some of the stories or talks about the time period in which he wrote the story, Rip Van Winkle, he basically indicates that he was on a schooner that was going up the Hudson Valley. He was going to Kinderhook from Manhattan. Mm-hmm. And he was told this story about this power on Hunter Mountain by the guy who was piloting the schooner, because he was an indigenous guide. And so it's his way of sort of keeping that lore alive by just sort of adding it onto the story. It's kind of like, here's the story I'm going to tell you that's this kind of fun story, but here's a kind of underlying, sort of the dark underbelly of this place. Mm-hmm. And he does that in a lot of his stories. I mean, he's well known for certain tales, but apparently in the early 20th century, he was known for other stories as well. And some of them do have to do with haunted ships, or haunted boats that are connected to the American Revolution. Some of them, there's this one interesting and very bizarre story that I talk about in the book specifically, that has to do with a community that has now been absorbed into Jersey City, but I guess there's still a neighborhood. The neighborhood that he's talking about still exists. And when he knew it, it was a Dutch settlement, but it was a Dutch settlement that had been made on top of the site where the worst indigenous massacre of during Keefe's War of indigenous people had occurred, and in that story he talks about how it's almost like the Dutch people there have their stories about hauntings, but there's this thing that they know about that they won't talk about.
Yep.
And it's what they're sitting on. And he, so anyway, I talk about all of this kind of stuff. So I guess the question in there is, he saw a sentimental story, and this is the argument that some scholars have made, that sentimental story kind of touches on that stuff, but it's an attempt to try to return things to a kind of normalcy. It's sort of like, we can engage in this kind of reminiscence of the past or these troubling things, but there's a kind of nostalgia, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And the difference between that and Gothic literature is that Gothic literature sort of keeps you unsettled.
Yes. Yeah, it doesn't resolve. That's exactly the difference. The sentimentalism lets you off the hook about about the discomforting thing. Because so much of, the rise of Gothic literature was happening at the same time as the rise in the transatlantic slave trade. There's a violence, there's a global violence that's happening, and the Gothic doesn't really let you forget that. And whereas sentimentalism wants to, just like you're saying, sort of have this kind of, this quaint folkloric thing, and then the stuff that we don't talk about. But then Irving also, though, was such a sharp, insightful person about human nature, and so just gently not letting, that's why that postscript on Rip Van Winkle is so important, because it's appealing to the sentimental reader, but it's not letting them off the hook. It's almost like he's doing both sentimentalism, and that postscript is like the Gothic tagline.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. and if you actually read deeply, if a person reads deeply into even stories like the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, you see things like that in there as well. That's more. There's a lot of stuff about class in
Oh,
that
oh,
in that story, and you know, and what's interesting about that story now, of course, is that, and you probably know this, but you know, Kinderhook is actually the place where the ambiance comes from, you know, for that
yeah.
story. But when I reread it now, I find it to be incredibly creepy. It's not a happy tale.
No,
It's,
it's so evocative. It really holds up. Like that's one Legend of Sleepy Hollow for me is like one of my favorite classic stories because I think it's a great Gothic tale. I think it's absolutely like you're saying, talking about class. It's about the fear of the other, the Hessian
right.
being this other who is still feared by the Dutch. He's definitely picking up on the petty small town family grievances. You know,
And Ichabod's another too. You
right?
know,
Exactly,
there's
exactly.
this kind of this you know, he's picking up on the anti-intellectual kind of
Absolutely.
aspect of you know, and it's funny for those of us who live in the Hudson Valley, you do have these little enclaves of people who families like Dutch families, and I'm not going to pick on the Dutch specifically, but um, Dutch families whose families have been here for 300 years or so,
Yep.
and they are very, I don't know what, there's no other word to talk about it, clannish. You know, they're very specific about their community, their village, what they will, who's considered an insider, who's considered an outsider, and they'll be friendly to you and everything. I mean, it's not
Oh
like
yeah.
that, but you're not really part of them, you know, and they let you know that,
Yep.
and some of that is defined by some of these stories, you
Yeah.
know, and you know, so I do talk about those kinds of things in the book. The other thing I was going to ask you about is I'm looking at this thing that's behind you, this strangely beautiful book here.
Yeah. That
Wh-
was
wh-
my debut. That was my debut novel. So
yeah. So I did a little, like, while you were talking,
like, what's this about?
I did a little bit of like research on that book. It's just to get the synopsis and everything. And so can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to specifically write that, and what role does Jack the Ripper play in that book?
So I wrote. So Strange and Beautiful was inspired by my first trip to England, and I took a Jack the Ripper tour, and I just really was fascinated by the history. And I thought, what if? And I asked myself, like, what if Jack the Ripper was in fact a paranormal entity? And this, I had asked this question right before I started working for the Cincinnati Shakespeare Festival. And so I was working on all of these different Shakespeare plays, and I was engrossed in, like, you know, the bard. Shakespeare as a storyteller is like the core of so much of our modern storytelling. We're kind of just all like leaning into a bunch of Shakespeare tropes. And so here I was, you know, my brain just overflowing with Shakespeare. But at the same time, my minor in college had been studying the 19th century. And so Jack the Ripper happening in 1888, that's a particular year that I have a fascination with, to the point where it's otherworldly. My fascination with the year 1888 crops up in all kinds of different aspects of my life. I think it's a past life thing. I feel connected to that particular time period in a way that is unresolved, in a way that is seeking, in a way that absolutely wants to, like, scratch at the surface of that time period and find my way through it. And I had characters that just kind of literally waltzed into my mind, that populated the Strangely Beautiful universe. And there's three books that are a part of it, and it's a intertwined family saga that has uh, themes that go back to Greek mythology. And it is the idea of, like, what if what if Jack the Ripper was a creature from the underworld and trying to like come and look for something that had gone missing? So I was asking myself these questions, while I was steeped in walking the streets and walking the paths where these women had lost their lives. Um, and just kind of thinking, what if I can create a Gothic novel? It is absolutely a Gothic novel. What if I can put all my favorite things? The idea of like, what if a very Jane Eyre narrative, one of my favorite books, what if Jane Eyre is very entwined with, say, like a haunted academy? I love dark academia as a genre. What if I have this sort of haunted school? What if I'm dealing with this sort of outsider character who's coming in, haunted by your own demons? And what if it's just what if there's just ghosts everywhere? So for me, it was just a real exploration of all of my favorite things with my love of Gothic literature, my love of a Gothic novel, my interest in the 19th century, having gone to England specifically for a research trip for a school project, and just being obsessed with what I'd found there. And it just, from that point, these characters unfolded that have a paranormal mystery to solve. And then I took that forward, where it goes forward in time, and the finale of the series ends with the First World War. So it's dealing with some very difficult real history in the midst of some fantastical adventures.
Okay, cool. That sounds very cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been one of my great loves. Is like, that particular book was just, it was the kind of my guiding light. I'd been pursuing a career in theater as a professional actress for many years, and when I moved to New York in 2005, I was at a Broadway callback, and all I could think about was Strange and Beautiful. And I asked myself, what is going to make my soul happy? What will I regret if I don't do in this life? And I looked in the mirror at that Broadway callback, and I said, I got to do the book. So I stopped auditioning, shifted away from theater full time, and then moved into trying to get my books published. And that's been my path ever since. Wow. I still do theater periodically, but books are my foremost love and and profession, as well as being a ghost tour guide, which is fun.
Yeah, you got to make your money somewhere, right?
All told, all together from a bunch of different plates that I spin, it all works.
Right. Yeah, I understand. I mean, I ran away from academia for a similar reason. So it's like, do I really want to go to conferences and try to convince people to listen to, I'm trying to convince academics to listen to the importance of paranormal story. I mean, now it's become all the thing, but
right. And I'm very grateful that we've had our books now being taught in folklore classes and being taught in women's history classes about the idea of shaping narratives. I'm grateful for all of that, but yeah, I do not envy you trying to. When I know how legitimate the subject matter is, I do not envy you trying to tell people its legitimacy.
Yeah.
Of course, my parents were both academics.
I mean, because it was like 20 years ago. I mean, when I wrote my dissertation on alien abduction narratives in the U.S. In the last 3 years, I have had more people ask me for my dissertation than in the previous 17 years. I mean, it's been ridiculous. So it's like, well,
you were ahead of the curve there.
Yes, I was ahead of the curve, and it affected my ability to get a job, and now I'm fine. It just took a while.
It is hard. I mean, the paranormal life, it's like it's a difficult thing when you have to navigate the spaces and places where you can and can't talk about this stuff, or where it will or won't be taken seriously, regardless of if you are a believer or not. Sometimes just the subject matter itself is a non-starter for some people.
Oh yeah. People don't want to know about it. They don't want to talk about it, or it scares them. I guess it scares them.
And I want to have, and I do always want to make sure that I'm holding space in my heart to respect the fact that for some people, this stuff is legitimately terrifying. And I never want to make light of that, because sometimes that terror is coming from a legitimate trauma, traumatic experience at any point in life. But at the same time, I also want people to be able to feel like we can have a dialogue about it, without me trying to convince you. It doesn't matter to me if you're a believer or not when you read my work. I have had people outright in reviews outright deny my own lived experience. I'm like, I don't know how to tell you. Like, I had witnesses. This really happened. I'm sorry you don't believe me, but it's in the book because it really happened. So sorry for your lack of belief being so adamant that you cannot believe a shared experience. I can't help folks with that.
Yeah,
I'm trying to tell. Yeah, I would like the same respect of, like, I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. Don't you tell me I didn't experience what I experienced.
Yeah, I know. It's I've often defaulted to just like not talking about my own experience, just because of all of that.
Yeah.
And because it's a habit.
Yeah.
It's a habit. So
one of the in the introduction to A Haunted History of Invisible Women, I talked about a young man from the South who had come on one of my ghost tours in Manhattan, and he just between the stops, I invite all of my guests to come in and talk to me and ask me questions about this. And he just wanted someone to talk to about the fact that he saw his departed grandmother come to his living room, and he'd kind of been encouraged forward by his father, who's buried, and young kid, maybe 12 years old. And I said, well, how do you feel about that? Because you never know what kind of relationship people had. So I don't want to presume that this was a welcome thing necessarily. And he said, well, I like it. It feels nice. I miss her. And I said, well, I bet she misses you too. And I bet she's just checking in on you. And I believe you. And I bet you will figure out, though, that there's going to be some places and spaces where you're not going to be able to tell that story, because not everybody's going to be able to believe you. I do trust that you will discern where and when you can and can't talk about that. And that kid took that to heart, I think. I mean, it just, like, he sat with that. Because I think he'd probably already experienced the people who he'd told that story to, and they either laughed at him or made fun of him. And, I'm sure that had already happened. And so the father just kind of nodded at me a thank you of, like, just sitting with it, just like letting someone share their experience, just saying, okay, all right, I'm glad you had that thing that made you connected to your loved one.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
discernment is big.
I mean, it's like, one of the things I discovered when I, was putting together the materials for my book, it's called Mysterious Beauty, Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley. And, I didn't, like I said, I didn't limit myself to ghosts.
Yeah.
Because the Hudson Valley is known for a lot of other things.
All kinds of things. Yeah.
So, and my own background is studying UFO contact stories, contact narratives and stuff. But what I found was, and like everybody who's done this here has found this, is like, if I used to do local presentations on the paranormal, on mostly UFOs, but some stuff on cryptids. And, but what was interesting is that afterwards you would always get people who would tell you not only UFO stories, but they would tell you their ghost stories, and they would tell you their poltergeist stories. And they, it's like all of these things are all together all the time. So, I don't even really know exactly how they're connected or what, what the dividing line between one thing is and another, because a lot of times, someone who will see strange lights in the sky, which, by the way, it's always going on. We had like just 5 nights ago. Sorry, it was over the weekend. This week is a lost week. 5 nights ago, last weekend, there were at least I don't know. I saw at least a dozen reports of strange lights that were being seen from New Paltz to Poughkeepsie, all the way up to Saugerties and Hyde Park.
Mhm.
And several people had pretty decent video of them. And nobody ever knew what they were. But a lot of times people who have those, who see those kinds of things, then that stuff will follow them home, and they'll have weird poltergeist experiences at home or whatever, So it's very, I don't know, I mean, I know that when we think of ghosts, we think of them as being like, spirits of our loved ones or something. Although, like, we really know what spirits are. That's just the word we use for that.
Right.
But I don't know that we really know what any of that is. I am interested though in what you were saying about, the clothes that ghosts wear, because there is this tradition in Europe, and it's European. It's a European tradition of ghosts being seen in plaid shirts, which has been, I don't know if it's a current thing, like if people are still seeing that, but I've run across this a lot in older material, and it reminds me of an experience that my father had, where he had this he used to talk about it, this very intense ghost experience when he was a child, where he was awakened in the middle of the night, and he saw this person at the foot of his bed, and it felt like this person was like digging around on his feet, but then he realized that the person was transparent, and it completely freaked him out. And this person was obviously doing something. It was like they were looking for something, like on a table or something. And that person like moved up his leg up to his head, and was clearly not aware of him, like the fact that he wasn't messing, that he was messing with a person and not with stuff on a table. And
that is terrifying.
And but this guy had a plaid shirt on. He was able to see him very clearly.
Wow.
And he once he got up to his head, my dad said he freaked out. He just started screaming, and his older brother came and turned the light on, and of course, boom, it was gone.
Right.
But then later on, after he calmed down and everything and went back to bed, he did manage to get to sleep, but he said he woke up right, like sort of at dawn, when the sun was just starting to come in, and he could see a figure standing in the corner of his room, kind of looking in his direction. And he had this plaid shirt on again. So he knew it was the same guy,
Wow.
But I do remember that house they lived in, because I do remember one weird thing that happened there, that like it was at Christmas. I guess I'm remembering it because it was Christmas. We were visiting, and all of the it was one of those things where they always divided the kids up, from the adults, and so the kids would all sit in the other room and eat.
Kid table.
And the kid table, the kid room, and then the parents or the adults would be in a different room. And so it was, everybody had finished eating, and we were all just sort of hanging out. And the parents had kind of moved back to the living room, and I don't know, I guess the female members of the family were beginning the cleanup, and we heard this noise, in the kids, we all heard this noise together, and we couldn't figure out what it was. And we thought it was one of the adults moving around. But when we looked into the other room, there was nobody in the room, and we could all hear footsteps going around the dinner table, that was the empty dinner table there. We could hear them, and we were all just like, oh, wow. That's like one of my first memories of a paranormal experience. It was very strange. So the house was definitely haunted. But so yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the clothes because I remember reading the stories and going, what is the plaid thing about? is it because lots of people wore plaid shirts? I mean, like,
that's so specific, or did it just become something that became like this repeated part of ghost lore that people didn't question? I don't
yeah,
I don't know where the origins of some of these repeated themes come from.
Yeah, well, like the lady in white or the lady in gray.
That one.
The lady in white, the lady in gray.
That the sort of the spectral spectrum of the different shades. That one you can kind of chalk up to the amalgams of women's ghost lore. It has an openness to it that seems to track a little bit more than the specificity of the plaid shirt. I'm fascinated by that. I have no idea. That is you'll have to keep in touch with me, because if you ever find the origin of the plaid shirt ghost
of the plaid shirt, yeah. I mean, I think that there actually has been a couple, like I seem to remember an article written about that, but it might be like an older thing, and it might be might be American too. That I don't know. It's interesting.
There's all these regionalisms that crop into it, and so you don't necessarily. It's so hard to find what that initial cultural influence that creates a specificity that gets repeated because the specificity is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is interesting. Another thing the plaid shirt thing for me is interesting because there was another incident that occurred. I did not witness this. I lived in a house in Kansas City, Missouri that was haunted. And I experienced other things there, but I didn't experience this particular thing. I had a roommate, and we rented the second and third floors of this very large house, and of course we had a separate entrance that would lead us into that they had built that would lead us up into the second floor. Well, if you went in our front door, interior front door, and you'd go right up the stairs, my bedroom was immediately to the right, and like I had two rooms, and it was immediately to the right, and then right in front was like a kind of a bathroom for everybody, and then to the left was this large living area, and then if you kind of went all the way up the stairs and like made a U-turn to your left, there's stairs to the third floor, which is where my roommate mostly hung out. Well, she came home late one night. I was in bed, and she came in the front door. All I heard was screaming. That's all I heard. It woke me up, and I came out. I was like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
And apparently she had come in the front door and had looked up the stairs, and there was some like street light coming in, and she had seen a man standing at the top of the stairs in a plaid shirt and dungarees, and she had thought that he was an intruder, obviously.
Well, yeah.
And so she had screamed, and he hadn't reacted, and he had just turned and gone to the left towards the living room and disappeared just like that. Freaked her completely out.
Yeah.
But he was in a plaid shirt too.
Weird.
So
hey, we got like 2 minutes.
So plaid shirts, on the thing for plaid shirts.
Okay, research. That's a research prompt.
They're grunge, dude, bro. That's what it is.
There you go. There you go. They really love Nirvana.
Yeah.
As do I.
Or maybe plaid shirts are only related to me. I don't know.
Well,
I do.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I'm
I was
done.
gonna say Christina's going to be here more, but the animals are acting crazy. But they're acting nuts. But Leanna, it's been a great show with a great way to end the year with this final show of the year. We appreciate it so much. Do you have a website or anything you want to give out?
Yes, if you go to leannarenehieber.com, you can check out all of my books. Also, if you look for America's Most Gothic Haunted History, Stranger Than Fiction at any of your favorite retailers, it is available wherever books are sold. We have it available in audiobook with Andrea and I reading our respective chapters. It's here in a beautiful hardcover. It's also digitally available. So, yeah, America's Most Gothic. That's our latest, and definitely would love to hear your thoughts. I'm on most of the social medias. I'm trying to stay off of them and finish a book deadline by the beginning of the year, but I do love to hear from folks. So yeah, if you go on to leannarenehieber.com, there's a contact page, and it goes right to, you can email me if you have any questions or thoughts.
Well, we appreciate it. It's a great show, and we hope everybody has a Merry Christmas. And you can tell Tom that Facebook banned me for 7 days for sharing my GoFundMe on I can't message people in my inbox.
No, I'm so sorry to hear that. You've been trying to raise money for the animals. Oh my gosh, I'm so
A
sorry.
lot of people do that. It was weird that they did that.
Yeah.
I sent it to. No, it's weird because GoFundMe lets you hook it to Facebook Messenger and
Right.
send it through GoFundMe to people. So I guess they try to make it seem like I was a fisher or something.
Oh, that stinks. I'm sorry to hear that.
Christmas, I can write people again.
Well,
How
just
nice of them.
hang in there.
What a Christmas gift.
Oh my gosh. Well, hang in there. Take care of it. Scratch all your animals. Pat all your animals for me.
We appreciate it. Great show. Tell Tom I said hi, and he's
Thanks,
going to come on
everyone.
at some point in the future. And
Yeah.
we appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great Christmas.
Thanks
everybody.
again for your time, everybody.
Take
Have
it
a good-
easy.
Have
You
a good
too.
weekend. Good night, everybody.
Good night.